afternoon to everybody. It's a big pleasure to be here to introduce the second edition of the Goodwin Lecture by the Department of Economics and Statistics. Unfortunately, our rector, Professor Riccaboni, cannot be with us today because he has a meeting in Barcelona for academic reasons, so it is not in Vigo, not in Vigo. And just to say welcome to everybody, and particularly to Professor Xavier Labandeira from the University of Vigo and from temporary, I suppose, to European University Institute. Is a big pleasure to have your lecture today here. We are really sympathetic on the topic of environment in our university. There is a large project on sustainability sponsored by our University of Siena jointly with other universities in the Mediterranean area, and so I probably leave to the introduction for Simone Borghesi, and you can start, Simone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelangelo. Maybe I will first leave the stage to Alessandro Vercelli, changing a bit the program, because I would like him to introduce the Goodwin Lecture for the audience, and then I will introduce the speaker.
Thank you very much, Simone. Just 2 words on the Goodwin Lectures. The Goodwin Lectures are organized by the Department of Economics and Statistics in continuity with a long tradition of this department, and more in general of the University of Siena, a tradition of high-level events in the field of sustainability, and of course extensive teaching and research in this field. We were, for example, the first Italian university that introduced a degree in environmental economics, and now the university as a whole is involved in a very important international project. The crucial motivation behind this series of lectures is the conviction that the recent financial crisis, the ensuing great recession, and unfortunately the ongoing, I would say, euro crisis of the Eurozone, are the consequence of a model of growth that is unsustainable from the economic, social, and environmental point of view. Therefore, we cannot hope of getting out of the crisis in a durable and satisfactory way without changing the existing model of growth in the direction of sustainable development. The increasingly alarming process of global warming makes the change very urgent. The final document approved in the COP21 Paris conference was adopted by 195 countries, but so far it was more a mediatic success that still has to verify from the pragmatic point of view. And its implementation will be certainly is at the moment and will be also in the future very difficult and controversial. So the idea behind the Goodwin Lecture is that by inviting distinguished scholars who have given important contribution to the scientific and political issues of sustainability, we aim to understand better the crucial requirements for sustainability and how we can implement it through adequate policy measures. The last thing that I want to say is that we entitled this new series of lectures to Richard Goodwin not only because this eminent economist has been our colleague and inspired for many years, but also because his approach to economics was very broad and farsighted, focusing on the complex dynamics of the interaction between economic, social, and natural constraints. And I believe that an in-depth study of sustainability may still learn a lot from his interdisciplinary and pluralist approach. So this is all that I wanted to say about the philosophy underlying this series of lectures. And I give now the floor to Professor Simone Borghesi, who is Professor of Environmental Economics and President-elect of the Italian Association for Environmental and Resource Economists, of Environmental Resource Economists. He will introduce the lecture.
I can use this. Thank you, Sandro, and thank you everybody for being here. But first of all, thanks to Xavier, who is a pleasure for us to have him, and thank you to Aldo Ravazzi, who also made a remarkable effort, I should say, to be here with us. Pleasant and remarkable, yes, both. Let me say a few words on the speaker. Xavier studied at UCL, London, and got his PhD subsequently in Vigo, where he got his positions and is still now as a professor of economics. But he's also right now the director of the Climate Policy Research Unit of the Florence School of Regulation at the European University Institute. He's also director of Economics for Energy, which is a research center in Spain, and Ergon, which is a European platform of researchers on energy efficiency. He visited several places around the world during his career, from Arizona to California, from Oxford to UCL, from Zurich to somewhere else. He's traveling too much, that's my conclusion. And in terms of contributions, he's at a crossroad, I would say, between public economics, environmental economics, and in particular energy efficiency within environmental economics, and so also energy economics. And as a matter of fact, he has many publications in the top journals in energy economics. He was also lead author for the IPCC, and what I find particularly remarkable are his own contributions in terms of policy papers, so to speak. He wrote many reports, he directed lots of international projects, but what I really appreciate, I have to say, is his contribution in terms of policy-oriented contributions, so indications to the policymakers. So his research is very methodologically robust. He always tried to give these policy indications in a clear way. And as such, he was also invited recently, 1 month ago, 1.5 months ago, to the European Parliament for an audition on the topic that is going to present today. Xavier is a low-profile person, so I said too much because he didn't want me to say too much, but at least these are a few words to present our speaker. And before leaving the stage to Xavier, I would like to present also Aldo Ravazzi. Well, most of you in the room who work on environmental economics don't need a presentation for Aldo, because he's a very well-known voice in the Italian environmental economics context. I will just say that he's a chief economist at the Ministry of the Environment right now, and where he's actually raising a very good group of young environmental economists, which was badly needed in Italy out of the university, in my view. And he's an absolute expert in environmental taxation. He played or plays, I can't tell, Aldo, you will have to tell me, as a negotiator for the Italian government in the environmental agreements, international agreements. And actually, I think I should use the present in the sense that he still does. And as a matter of fact, he's about to leave tomorrow for Japan. So on his way to Japan, he came to Siena, and this is a remarkable, also pleasant effort on the way, exactly. So now it's time to stop, or better, time to start. I will like to leave the floor to Xavier.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Hello, everybody. And first of all, I want to apologize for not speaking Italian. It's a bit weird that so closely with languages like Spanish or Galician, which I speak, and Italian, that we have to communicate in English, but especially with myself being now in Florence. But hopefully next time I come, I will be able to do the seminar in Italian. For me, it's an honor to be here. I want to thank Simone for the very kind words of introduction. And it's an honor to be here because, first of all, for an academic, being in one of the oldest universities in Europe is also, something special. And this is one of the very, very, very old universities. Second, to give a lecture with this name for an economist is, of course, another big honor. And third, because I think in this university, as Angelo was saying before, and the director of the department was saying before, the environmental issues are important. People like Simone, Silvia, are very well-known academics in our field. They are really people who know more than me many of the issues I will speak today. So for me, it's a pleasure to be here also because of that. And finally, Aldo. I mean, he's one of the people who has been involved in the debates on environmental taxation in Europe for many years. I attended many of his speeches, roundtables, etc. And I, myself being originally an economist very interested in environmental taxes, for me it's an honor to have him as a discussant. So it's a risky suggestion what I did to Simone to talk today, because he invited me to come here to give a seminar or a lecture. And he told me, look, I mean, not a normal paper, something wider and which could be appealing for different types of people, professors specialized, and also students or people from different areas. And I suggested to do something on European climate policies. And this is a very, very wide area, as you can imagine, and I will deal with most of the topics. It's also a controversial area. Some people here are, participating in the COPs. I will talk about the COP. Some of the people have a book on the EU ETS in press, and I'm going to talk about the EU ETS. Some of the people are also experts in energy demand. I will talk. So it's a risky business, as you can imagine. I will try. Don't expect myself to be able to answer all the questions, because I think that not many people anyway will be able to answer all the questions. But I did that. I did this. I I choose this because I wanted to try to give an overview, try to give some general information and some approach on how economists see some of the things, how could we act in this area, and how could this area also influence or give demands to economics, let's say that, and I will finish with that. I hope to talk about 50 minutes or so and leave time for questions, although I know that many of them I probably won't be able to answer them properly. I want to invite you all to follow us in FSR Climate. I think we are around the corner, and we are a small university. We need audience and participants in our activities. I think we are doing a lot of stuff, particularly on climate policies, on European climate policies. This was the reason for this center. It's a small one, but I think that we are doing some interesting stuff for 5-6 years. I'm only here for a couple of years now. But our objective is to become a kind of a hub of economic researchers and policymakers and stakeholders discussing European climate policies. And well, if we have a lot of people here around the corner, I would invite you to come to our activities. I know that many of you are following, some of you are following our activities, and I would invite the rest to do it. Well, let me stand now. So let me show you the contents of this lecture. First, I would like to talk a bit about what I understand of European climate policy and how to assess it. Second, I would like to put this in a wider context because I think it's important to know where European climate policy stands. I mean, it's not something unrelated to what's going on in Paris or in the world, or what we think about climate change effects, etc. Third, I would like to talk briefly about, as you can see, only with any of these topics we have a lecture. I would like to talk briefly about how this stands in economics, because what are the topics that, at least for me as an economist, are an economist interested in public policies, are interesting me, and I think that are important topics. And then I will go into the description and try to assess it, because again, any of these 4 pillars take hours, right? EUTS, renewable policies, energy efficiency and taxation, and finally some conclusions, some ideas on how we economists should probably act in this area, and what are the demands we should expect, and what are the advices it comes with. Well, what is European climate policy? So some people may think EUTS. Some other people think, well, other Brussels-based policies, but I think it's more than that. I think that it's, first of all, EU national and subnational strategies, and this is really, really important to understand. When I came to Florence, we were quite focused on the EUTS, and I told my team, look, I mean, what we really need to have in our radar is not only the EUTS, of course, but not only other European Union fostered policies, but also national policies, which are in many countries really important, and they are part of the European climate policy. For instance, there is a report of the European Energy Agency, and they talk about 138 member state measures related to climate policies. So this is an inventory which is quite recent, so you can imagine that really this is important, right? And not only member state, but also national, city councils, etc., regions. some of these policies are related between them. Some of the national policies that are being implemented stem from the European framework for energy efficiency, for renewables, but some others don't. So we have to take this into account as well. Some are linked or related, some others are either because some countries decided to introduce some specific actions or for other reasons. Also, I think that we are not talking only about explicit CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions reduction policies. We are talking about other instruments that perhaps are not exactly defined to reduce CO2 emissions, but are playing a role here. All of you can imagine that the renewable energy support promotion, perhaps there are many other issues behind, but climate change is one of them. Therefore, I will deal with this. Energy efficiency is the same, energy taxation is the same, and I'm following a bit this debate on what is an environmental tax. At the beginning, we distinguish between environmental taxes and energy taxes. At the end, we put energy taxes into the environmental field in a way, because although there are many reasons for them outside the environmental area, they are having the implicit effects. Well, how do we assess European climate policy? Taking a paper by Borghesi, which I recommend, it's a critical assessment of European climate policy, published a few years ago in reviews around economics policies studies. And basically what he says is, well, there are three main ideas that we should use to evaluate European climate policies as a whole. First, well, if the policy is complying with its objective, which is greenhouse gas reduction, mitigation. And he says it's doing it, right? Because emissions are going down, and therefore climate policies in Europe are working well. Right, who are working on this. The third thing he says is, well, European climate policies could be assessed in terms of their contribution to wider international agreements. And, you know, this, I understand that it is not so much as I will interpret later, like, okay, the EUTS could help actions in other countries because we are learning things and because we are doing an experiment here. He's more into the political will. Borghesi is more into the political will. Okay. The European Union with its actions is helping this, and he says yes. We might talk a bit later. And then he asks about cost effectiveness, and there he says no. This European climate policy is not cost effective because there are a number of issues which I will deal with them later. Right? If you want to have a much more negative assessment of European climate policy and energy policy in general, we didn't put him here, but Peter Hammond has a paper the same year in energy policy, which is really saying that it's not working. Right? It's creating problems and suggesting change. Right? I would add the fourth issue, which I think is very important for assessing policy, in general any public policy, but in particular climate policy, which is the distribution. By distribution, I'm not only meaning how to distribute burdens among countries, but also the impacts of different instruments or policy packages on, for instance, people, different regions, different groups, workers, on workers, etc. Well, but before that, let me put the issue in a bit of the context, the issue of climate change. I'm starting now with the second part. You can see how quickly with the topics. This is the change of the temperature with respect to the industrial levels. And what's happening lately is really, really worrying. You know, I mean, what we are seeing is that the last months, the increases with respect to the pre-industrial temperatures at the global level are going up. Of course, we have a million in the last few months, but this is starting to be really worrying. Look what's going on in 2016. It seems that there is a different pattern. Because this is, for instance, the 19th century. This is the evolution of the temperatures monthly. Then you can see that in the 20th century, we are increasingly, as long as we go closer to now, and look at this year. What's going on? This was what happened in February, and basically what you see is that the anomaly, we are not talking about industrial levels, but we are talking about the 1950s, the period 1950s, 1951, 1980. The anomaly was 1.35 degrees over that period. It's a lot. It's a lot. And this was just released by the NASA. And what you can also see is that, especially, this is not a uniform problem, but it is happening especially in the northern hemisphere. And you can see Russia here, you can see Canada here. Really problematic. And when you see this in March, it's the same, because we saw it here. When you see this in January, it's the same. When you see in the last months of 2015, it's the same. And then, that's why I updated this presentation this morning, because this morning in the hotel I took the New York Times, I put here with me, and in the front page of the New York Times today, you have this news on northern wildfires tied to climate change in Canada. And this is a phantom ghost town, ghost city, not town, because they have 7,000 people or so, which everybody had to flee because of the fires, and it's obviously related to what's happening here. There's anomalies of temperatures in that area are very, very high, and scientists are becoming really worried. I think that for people who are working in this area, in contact with IPCC people working for 2-1, it's really worrying what we are receiving. And I think that this shows that even the conservative approach of IPCC is becoming conservative. So basically this is the setting, which is a bit worrying, which will suggest at the end that we have a lot of time, and this will give us some lessons or some suggestions for economics. We need to implement soon some of our methodologies to check, which policies work, which policies are not so good. Because first of all, it's really urgent. What's going on? It seems that it's getting out of control. That's what it seems. And second, the type of policy is huge. I mean, we are not talking about controlling water pollution in the river or air pollution in the Rome. We're talking about a huge problem that needs huge policies as well. So why is so difficult to deal with this issue? I think that we as economists have some ideas, and just going very, very quickly. This is the perfect externality. Marty Wakeman came to Florence last October, and he said this, and this is the perfect externality. Perfect not in the good sense, but in the bad sense, like the perfect external. And basically because we have a lot of characteristics in this area. First, we are talking about the global volume. So this, when you have a kind of a public good, public bad Second, we have intergenerational issues. This dynamic, basically dynamic problem, and non-reversibilities, which makes very, very difficult to deal with the typical policies that we have with this topic. I mean, we are dealing with the stock. We are not dealing with the flow. And this means that many of our policies are designed, you know, like control pollution in a river or in a flow. We know how to do it by acting with the flow. But with the stock, it's much more difficult. It's a stock. What we need I mean, what's creating the damage and what we really need to have under control. Of course, the stock is related to the flow. And then we have the issue of uncertainty that at the beginning, many of the climate skeptics, they were using to delay. But Martin Waitman, who is contributing, has contributed a lot in this area, showed us in Florence that nowadays is the opposite. But I mean, uncertainty is a reason for acting as soon as possible, because we have these bad days and all these ideas of this, and therefore we may believe that we are getting into a 2-degree increase of temperature with certain concentration. We may implement some policy, and at the end we may have 4 degrees, and that's really, really problematic. So therefore, and this, in a way, we put it together, not necessarily should be together. We're talking extreme events related to these possible differences in increasing temperatures, for instance. Okay, this is the context, right? The more theoretical context, let's say, and the climate context. And let's start talking a bit about the EU. And you already saw the general overview by Rector. I quite agree with you. But what I'm seeing, and perhaps Aldo, we can discuss about this, is that it is true that the EU has contributed to this area and has fostered, but it seems that the EU, the influence that we have is going down. And probably there are many reasons for that. Our issues are going down. We are not a big player anymore, as we used to be in the 1990s. Or perhaps the political situation in Europe hasn't helped either. The case is that I think that this is an issue that perhaps we can discuss. In this third of the assessment by Borghesi on the EU climate policies in the world and the influence, it seems that since Copenhagen, our capacity and our visibility in this area is not as big as it was before. But of course, I'm surrounded by people who go to these places as negotiators. They have much more information than we do. Well, the Paris Agreement, of course, this is important for what we are going to say and for the future. I have mixed feelings with the Paris Agreement. I think it is not what I would to see, because basically it is clearly an inappropriate way to deal with this. I mean, it's like if you go in the bus and you ask people, how much do you want to pay to go in this bus? This is something similar. And at the end, if I go in the bus, I will only pay 1 cent. And really, the main issue here is the free riding associated to a global problem, and therefore, if we have a kind of a voluntary approach on national determined contributions, this is, from an economics point of view, it doesn't seem very, very powerful. But probably it was the best solution we could take. And I have some, at the end I will give some ideas on this. There are some nice. First of all, we have agreement. Second, we are here on the 2 degrees, and even on less than that, 1.5. We have verification, we have flexibility, we have a few things that are positive, but the main nature of the agreement is probably not good, and we will see how countries react to this, and we need to wait for a few years. It is not good because we are already seeing that the national determined contributions intended, or the ones that are already final ratification, are not able to be leading us to the 2 degrees. More or less, we are more into the 3 degree area, increase. This is a kind of report. I took it from the OECD. It's not specifically recent, but I took it so that you can see a few things. First of all, how emissions are going up a lot since 2000, and this reflects the failure of Kyoto, the big failure of Kyoto. You can see how emissions went up 60%, more than total emissions. And imagine that we implement the IPCC scenarios with the information we have for the countries. Still, we have, of course, the rate of increase will go down, but still we wouldn't reduce emissions, and this is incompatible with the 2 degrees. This is more into the 2 degrees, and we need a scenario of some extra policies, which are the ones that we would like to see from the countries in the next few years. Who knows? Here you can see what are the topics that the OECD thinks are crucial: energy efficiency, we talked a bit about that, subsidy reform, etc., renewables. Well, when an economist deals with climate policies, what are I would say, the basic issues that we have in mind? Well, most people attack this from an efficiency point of view, solve the externality. And this is the response to that. That's why we economists like a lot prices. Pricing greenhouse gases, because in theory this will solve the problem. And this is a typical solution. I think that less attention is usually given to distribution, which is a very, very important in this field. But anyway, we'll talk about this later. So this is the first best policy. But of course, there are second best departures because, well, first of all, there may be other market failures in this area. For instance, it may be difficult that people introduce, kind of the type of measures, energy efficiency measures in their homes because of lack of information or because the landlord-tenant problem. So there are other, or there might be the technological externality associated to renewable promotion or even new forms of energy efficiency. So there are other market failures. Second, we may have, we may be quite far away from the European context, and we may have exogenous objectives, such as the Paris objective, which is 2 degrees. This is what is behind that. Nobody knows, or not many people know, but apparently this started in a meeting of a few scientists in the 1980s in saying that 2 degrees was. But this is exogenous, so at the end, climate policies are not defined based on the optimal external damage, but rather on other things, and therefore we are in second place. 3, we may have leakage, so even if we are able to apply first best climate policy or first best taxes or prices, we may not want to do it because we know that if we do it, there will be leakage, and therefore we may go for lower levels, right? And then we have the issue of public revenues. At the end, we may want to raise prices, or with these prices for a number of purposes, and these leads us to suboptimal situations. So look, I mean, there are reasons for suboptimal prices or the existence of other instruments. For instance, for promotion of energy or for energy efficiency. I already mentioned a few examples. And when we have a cornerstone, and like they used to call it in Brussels, of European climate policy, like this, that we have other instruments that have indirectly impacts on emissions and therefore influence the cap, which is behind the ETS, then we have interactions, which may be affecting the cost effectiveness of the whole package. That's why Bollinger meant when he was talking about this. But we may also need, in this sense, policies to complement the ETS. And I talk about this later, because the ETS is also partial. It doesn't apply over the whole emissions. This is a bit the very basic economics of climate change and second best. Well, let's see EU greenhouse gas emissions. This is a diagram which I think a colleague of yours presented the other day, so it's taken from a DRC report, European Commission. And basically what we have here is, this is the evolution of European emissions, of the European Union emissions, and well, it's the best performer, really, right? If you compare this with, except Russia, but Russia, you know what happened here, a lot of hot air, right? A lot of companies related to heavy industries which really are driving this situation. But of course, we also have our own hot air in this area, right? With the Eastern European countries, but anyway, we are good performers. Look what's going on with China, which is really worrying. And the others, well, Japan stable, the US more or less stable, with respect to 1990. So this is the setting, so, well, it's okay. It's okay, it seems okay, right? Not such a good reduction when we think that in 2050 we may want to go to 95% of reduction with respect to 1990, but you know, at the end we are going down. But this is production based. Okay, so these are emissions emitted in the different countries. When we go for the other measure, which I think is sometimes more accurate, which is the consumption-based emissions, we see that our performance is much worse. So this is for the EU 28 what we do in terms of production-based, more or less. Sources are different, right? And the other source is the European Commission, this is the OECD, so there are some different in the figures, but overall they are similar in terms of production. So you see a reduction with respect to 1995 of 2011, but basically we are staying up stable, rather stable consumption-based emissions. This means that a lot of emissions that should be inputted or should be put into the EU are taking place outside, because they are taking place in China or in other places, and therefore the system is not working so well as we would like, right? Because of this situation. We may have policy tools to avoid this. This is another issue, and at the end I will keep this open. Okay, let's see the EU climate policy setting. We have the roadmap. We already told you about this. This is 18 to 95% reductions of greenhouse gas emissions towards the middle of the century, which fits nicely with the Paris setting, because the Paris setting more or less says that towards the second half of the 20th of this century, we should have neutral emissions, right? Which means that probably developed countries should be at zero emissions. And then developing countries perhaps will have some emissions, but there will be compensations. Probably more trees, or I don't know, carbon capture and storage. So that's what is behind the Paris Agreement, and this fits nicely to that. Well, climate policy in Europe started in 1990. We were one of the first places in the world to talk seriously about this. And I would say that the 1990s, and I don't know whether Aldo would agree with this, is a lost decade for the EU, because at the end there was a lot of interest in taxes, carbon taxes then, but it was not possible during the United Group, so at the end this was blocked. And they started with other energy efficiency and renewable programs, but really nothing happened, or not a lot happened, I would say so. I wouldn't be so negative. Things started to change after the Kyoto Protocol, and after the politicians in Brussels found out that it was impossible to go with the carbon tax, and that's why you have the ETS, right? Which is a pricing approach which doesn't require unanimity, and is thought to comply with the Kyoto Protocol. And remember, the Kyoto Protocol, at the end, the EU was the only basically there and complied with the Kyoto Protocol, which had a reduction of 8% for the EU with respect to 1990 for 2012, and there was an internal allocation of reductions. Some countries like Spain were allowed to increase emission. That's the EU ETS was thought to work for that. Well, just before the crisis, we have the 2020 package, which may seem like a joke, which is 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, 20% for energy efficiency, 20% for renewables, and for 2020. But, well, finally the numbers were, there were some studies behind the numbers, and basically this led to the first package that we already have, first EU climate policy package that we already have, and we are now in the 2030 framework with higher targets. You can see that there is a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions 40%, 27% for renewable energy over total energy consumption, 27% prediction of energy savings with respect to business as usual, although they want to increase this to 30% in 2020, they are willing to do that. And then everything is in this other package, which is the energy union. So the energy union is one of the Juncker Commission star projects. And so it fits also with climate policy because they talk about energy interconnections, which are really important for renewables, and they are talking also competitiveness issues. They are talking about energy security, so renewables and efficiency are getting to this, right? So that's part of the package, and of course the reform of EU ETS. Well, let's go into these four components of the European climate policy. First, we have the ETS. As you know, you have people here who want to talk about this, so I will direct the questions to them on the system. And the book is in the press, so it's updated. You know why we have this, I already told you. I would say that this is a learning by doing process, a truly learning by doing process, because we started with a directive in 2003, and this directive had to face really harsh times because of the crisis and problems, and there were a lot of changes. We have a first phase, which was a trial phase. Then we have the second phase, which was the Kyoto commitment phase, where things started to be, I would say, more stricter. Also, this phase allowed intertemporal use of permits, which was not the case before, so the price went to zero, as we expected. And now we are in phase 3. Phase 3 has some important changes with respect to the previous phases. And one very important, which I think it was not so valuable, but it is a very, very important change, is that we finally have an EU cap. So before you have the national allocation plans, each country had to file the allocation of permits, and this led to problems, to over-allocation in some cases. This changed in the third phase. And we also have, in this phase, benchmarking, which is a different approach with respect to the previous phase, where permits were allocated grandfather, as we call it in environmental economics, based on historical emissions. But now these allocations are based on the best performance, benchmarking, right? And then the third important change is the market stability reserve system, which is a response to the very low prices seen in the system. So basically the Commission started the process to find a system that could solve this, and they found a quantity-based approach. So basically when you have the total number of permits of permits that you could use, okay, so all the permits that were issued minus the permits that were used, when you have this over a certain limit, then automatically part of these permits are taken to the reserve, and in theory, there's supply and demand realignment, and prices should react. This is going to be applied at the end of this year for the next phase, right? And now we are discussing the next phase. As Simone said, I was in the Parliament a few weeks ago, starting the process of the assessment of the Commission proposal in the Environment Committee. And the changes we see here, we don't see a lot of change, because there is a declining cap, there is a reduction of the number of permits, but it happened before already in this phase. And this declining cap is to comply with the targets we talked before, right? The 20% target or the 2030 target. There is a lot, and perhaps we can discuss on this later, on competitive issues. This is the thing that is turning crazy the policymakers and we in Brussels. This is the main issue to say. That's why I interpreted when I went to the Parliament. This competitiveness issue, the free allocation, the benchmarking, because the benchmarking also becomes much more strict now in the fourth phase, right? And then the package has an institutional component, which I don't have time to describe. It's between countries, there's an important component, especially benefiting these European countries. Well, you can see the evolution of prices. This is probably more useful because you can see the peak in 30 euros, and you can see the level of prices that we have now, which are really, really low. They were actually extremely low a few months ago, a few weeks ago actually, around 4 something per kilo, per ton of CO2. And remember, we are talking about, economists talk about 30 euros per ton as sensible. Some people think that prices should be higher based on the social cost of carbon, but really 3, 4 are far below the type of prices that we were expecting in terms of costs. And also, remember that these prices should act to promote new technologies. So at the end, if coal power plant is facing these prices, no surprise that Germany in the big 90s is really booming because it's Okay, so there is also the price debate. Some people say, well, this is not an issue because this is a market, and therefore it's normal that markets have price variation. But on the other hand, these prices have also regulatory objectives, so this is an issue. And there is the question of can we expect the NSR to work? Because at the end, I mean, it's only temporary kind of shifting of permits. Is it enough, or there are other proposals that I don't know whether you are following by the French government, by the German government, that are talking about price floors, price collars. That's the type of things, and perhaps we can discuss this later. The problem is that anything that sounds price floor, price collar, sounds to tax. And tax is not very good in terms of process because you require money, etc. Well, how to assess the EUTS? I would say that we don't have a lot of evidence, academic evidence, because the time span is limited. But what we can say is that the results are not bad, in the sense that the environmental effects are seen to be positive, also using different methodologies, micro approaches, macro approaches. Of course, we are talking about small reductions of emissions, but they are there. And remember that also the other problem we have is that the price levels were low. So at the end, we have to be with low price level, and we shouldn't expect that much here, right? On the other hand, there are papers that have detected positive effects on innovation, patenting of low carbon technologies associated to the EUTS. And the competitiveness and linkage debate, which is so important now for policymakers, what we have as economists, as academics, don't show negative effects in this area. This doesn't mean that they cannot happen in the future, right? If the situation changes. But when I was telling this to the politicians in Brussels, I mean, it was like not well received by some people. They said that there are already important changes in industrial sectors in Europe because of the ETS. How we economists, academics, are saying these things. Well, that's what we have. You can have a look to our work, which I don't put here because I did it, because it was already done when I came, and also the EA has good reports on the assessment on the UETs. But I'm going to go quicker because I think I'm completing my time. Then we have renewable energy, and the key directive is 2009 directive, which has mandatory national targets. And different, I mean, it's slightly framework there, right? And then states, they can implement their different policies. And remember, after 2020, the 2020 scheme, which is more based on national targets, get diluted because there is only a general target for the whole of the EU for renewable. Right? It's not us today. National targets that add up to this global 2020 target. You can see that there is variation in the support schemes, feed-in tariffs, quota, obligations, all the instruments I'm not going into here. Also, there are some papers assessing this. There is an interesting paper, by the way, which I didn't put here, assessing the distributional effect of the German promotion of renewables, how they increase prices a lot of electricity and how this is being damaging the distribution. And I think that this report of the EA, I found it very, very useful. If you want to have a quick overlook of what's going on, if we are on track, if we are not, etc. I would give you a couple of thoughts on the bigger picture on renewables, right? And First, we are doing well. I mean, we are doing well by promoting so much learning by doing. Shouldn't we spend much more money on research, perhaps? And save money, because at the end, some of the promotion schemes have been really expensive. And we see the German case, the Spanish case. So should we change this? Second, should we be more picky? And perhaps ways are great. You know, it sounds good. They are very good for Galicia, where I come from, or from Scotland, for Scotland. But the global possibility of these technologies are probably lower. So should we invest in that? In that technology, or should we focus everything on solar? These are the type of things that I think that we as economists should put in the table. Because when you talk to an engineer, I mean, it's like everything's more or less the same. Okay, it's good because, well, but the costs are good. And the possibilities are very different. Well, this is a paper of FSR, and it's an example on how we may spend a lot of money, and this is the Italian case, on promotion of renewables, and if we put the money we spend into implicit carbon taxes, we end up with 1,000 euros, 600 euros. I mean, it's like a huge amount with respect to the price of the ETS. So this is probably not working very well. Of course, there are many other things behind this promotion. Industry, industrial objectives, energy security, blah, blah, blah. But, I mean, the figures I put is energy efficiency. I would say that this is a very complex issue. I already talked about the market failures here. I think that with policy approaches, it's difficult because it's also not an end in itself. I mean, energy efficiency is not good in itself. It's good because it saves emissions, it's good because it saves consumption. So this is something that we have to have here, and perhaps we have to be careful with the targets in energy efficiency, because perhaps other type of targets would be better. Emissions targets, or ratios of energy dependence targets, or industrial targets, I don't know. But anyway, I leave it open because probably it's controversial. I will tell you also that energy efficiency can be a distributional policy. And many economists only think of efficiency as a kind of solution for market failures, but it can be a powerful distributional policy, because at the end we may help some households who cannot afford live in a heated house to give up rent. Well, this is the legal framework, 4 directives. I won't enter into them. If you want, we can discuss these things later. The basic directive is 2012, the framework and efficiency directive. There are the 2 directives, but I won't go. This directive is quite based on national policies and on national reports, which is what it is this national energy efficiency. National energy efficiency plans. And actually, Simone was asking me if we were collaborating with Spanish government. We helped them to justify one of this need by providing a good kind of overview of the price elasticities of demand for energy. So they were justifying some effects of some taxes and other issues, and they wanted to have some academic background behind, so they asked us to do a report on energy demand in Spain. Well, it seems to be working, but well, this is a commission issue, so I won't go into that. Well, this is my favorite field. I don't have time, unfortunately, but it's also the most unfavorable climate policy in the EU, because we have a directive which is in the closet of some office in Brussels since 2011. I don't know whether Aldo will have information. The idea here, and this was a very good idea, was to increase energy taxes, harmonize energy taxes, and to incorporate a CO2 component which is related to the EU ETS. And this is good because we as economists want prices as wide as possible. So we don't want, this is a good policy interaction in a way, right? We want to cover the sectors outside the EU ETS. But unfortunately, this is, I think, dead or almost dead. We have some examples of carbon taxation in the EU. I won't go into them. And we have new tax reforms, which we talked about this. I think that Aldo is one of the experts in this area. And we have transport as well, which is a crucial sector. You cannot read anything here, but basically what I did was to put in comparable metrics, emission, tax rates across different European countries and different goods, and what we see is a lot of heterogeneity, not a lot of heterogeneity. So again, this is not happening. These are examples. Well, tax in transport, I think this is a big topic. Transport is a sector which increased emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, since 1990 in the EU. You saw the overall picture of emissions reductions at the EU. Transport emissions are up 20%, right? Around that figure. So it's a lot. And I think that this, despite the high taxes that some countries have, I would say that taxes on transport are not working anymore. I read a nice paper of yours on proxy, on new approaches to this. And I think that we need to think of this for the future. It's another task for us economists, new taxes in this sector, because they are not able to do their role anymore. We can discuss this later. I was going to tell you my sad story on energy taxes in Spain, but I better leave it for another moment, because basically the only tax which was not increased by this government, with all the difficulties of the Spanish government in terms of money. The only tax, well, there were two. One corporate taxation, and the other one, gasoline, diesel, and we are below European average. So there is a deep problem with these taxes. Don't know why. We used different methodologies, we checked the efficiency, we checked the distributional effects, we even went for preferences of people. We did a survey on public preferences of this in Spain, and we couldn't find the reason. Again, nice papers on this, some good papers, academic papers, and the EA, as usual, has a good report on that. And I'm coming to the end. This is the last, not the last, one of the three last. So, summing up, I would say cost effectiveness seems to have a problem in European climate policies. And long-term effectiveness seems to have problems. Because with the low level of prices that we are seeing, the investments necessary for the roadmap are likely to be increasing. So I don't see this very clear. Probably we need to think on supplementary effects with different policies. We need to be much more intense as economists, depending on the coverage of non-EU ETS sectors, which are out of control, as we could see transport. And we should be careful when we talk about multiple benefits, non-greenhouse gas emissions, because we should stick to the Timbergen problem, right? Which is, okay, if you want to deal with other issues like local pollution, go for local pollution regulation, rely on carbon taxation for that. That's an example. Which also would make more transparent the
European climate policy. And of course, they play, in that discussion, must play a bigger role. There are three main constraints for European climate policy at the moment, I would say. One is the competitiveness issue. I think that industries are really panicking on this. I cannot explain why. They are panicking, and they are also using this as a weapon to restore climate policy in Europe. I'm worried with that. The equity concern is the second part which we should be careful with, and the institutional setting is but there are opportunities, and I want to tell them not to appear pessimistic. One is perhaps Paris helps us with this, because if we think that Paris can make the main emitters, China, India, EU, USA, Russia, trust each other, then what is competitiveness issues? I mean, and implement national determined contributions with policies behind that are more in line, then it may work. Because once they constraint, which I think is very, very important, will disappear or which is okay. We are the only ones in the world doing things. We cannot progress. We don't have prices over €5. The second message, a positive message, is we should think that we are doing nicely for the world with our climate policy experience. We are doing learning by doing for the world. And we should think on the UTS as a prototype to other systems. We should think that perhaps we could play a role in linking other systems to ours, going towards the global price, as we had a failure as economists in Paris and around Paris on this. I think that we will also give a lesson to the world if we're able to talk seriously about the priorities of the world motion, what role research and development should play, what are the real potentials for the world, and try to have technologies ready for Africa and South America and Asia for the future. And of course, coordinating policy tools and jurisdiction is important because we could see the EU as a prototype also for the world in these areas. I think I would only add this border tax adjustments, and I leave it for the end. That's a positive normative message that we can consider in case everything else fails. And that is for the debate. The other things I already told you about them, so I'm not insisting. And I would say that, I close with this, the implications for economics. And I would say that this is not environmental economics. This is not energy economics anymore. This is not public economics anymore. This is much more important. And it applies to any discipline in our field, and we have to see that. Sometimes I'm surprised with the colleagues of other departments. This is the climate guy. I mean, this is really a big issue, and the whole of economics is involved. This is not the river, it's not the monkey. It's just a big issue. And we need all the tools and all the disciplines. And I would say that empirical economics has especially a big role. Because these climate policies, remember, they should be very quick, intense, and they are very sensitive. So we need to have ex-ante evaluation and exposure. I mean, we have a lot of work here, because otherwise it may be a failure, and we may spend a lot of money, and people may be tired of this, and at the end we want to solve the problem. I would end, you know that experimental economics is in a boom now, and I would say that experimental approaches are very important. We have experimental economics workshop in Florence last Tuesday, actually, on capital policies and experimental economics. I think that this is also something that we should consider. That's all. Sorry for it was too ambitious probably, and I took too much time.
Thank you very much, Xavier, for your making overview of the environmental policy in Europe. I give the floor to Professor Aldo Ravazzi, asking him to comment the presentation.
Tra Roma, Siena e il Giappone, consentitemi qualche parola in italiano, anche perché sono convinto che Xavier Labandeira parla un perfetto italiano ma con accento fiorentino e non ha usato qui a Siena. Io invece ho il mio accento romanaccio e le cose vanno così. Roma ama Siena sull'economia ambientale e dello sviluppo sostenibile per una serie di ragioni che probabilmente conoscete. Primo, perché avete qui un vivaio e una tradizione col professor Vercelli sul lato economico, il professor Tiezzi sul lato più ambientale, scientifico, tradizionale, perché avete la rete del Sustainable Development Solutions Network col professor Riccaboni, rettore, con Bastianoni e altri ricercatori che avete portato qui a Siena, al quale state contribuendo in maniera importante, perché è nata un'ASVIS, alleanza della società civile per lo sviluppo sostenibile, in cui di nuovo ci sono parecchi senesi che danno una mano a Enrico Giovannini a spingere la cosa pubblica a portare in Italia gli obiettivi di sviluppo sostenibile, perché avete un Simone Borghesi apprezzato dalla comunità tanto da essere nominato, come ricordava il professor Vercelli, presidente della nostra piccola ma solida associazione ormai degli economisti dell'ambiente e delle risorse naturali, che abbiamo fondato ormai 3-4 anni fa, e prepariamo la prossima conferenza a Roma a Tor Vergata a febbraio, per cui se avete qualche cosa da raccontare o semplicemente volete venire ad ascoltare, speriamo di vedervi. Non è un caso, cito due vostre colleghe che hanno incrociato la nostra via al Ministero dell'Ambiente. Orsola Mautone viene da Siena ed è oggi in Commissione europea, era arrivata con la squadra del greening delle autorità ambientali, il greening dei fondi strutturali europei, e da qualche settimana abbiamo Greti Lucaroni che è qui in sala. Greti, saluta, che ti riconoscono i colleghi e che mi sembra che regga bene l'impatto dell'arrivo nella giungla del Ministero dell'Ambiente a Roma. May I say that we start from an extraordinary year 2015, and I think this was very well inside the lines of what Xavier told us. We come from an agreement in Addis Abeba on finance for development. We come from the Agreement of Paris on climate change, and we come from the agreement in New York at United Nations on the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development with the Sustainable Development Goals. So 2015 has been an extraordinary year, and I hope we can build upon this in the next years. Second, I was in the Italian team negotiating in Paris. I had this chance. I was extremely frustrated as an economist. As Xavier said it, economics was not at the center of the negotiations. We don't have carbon pricing, we don't have carbon markets. It was not inside, it was not at the core of the negotiation. So I was extremely disappointed and frustrated. But at the same time, the point in Paris was not to build a very strong, solid, economically based agreement. It was to have an agreement. And we have now an agreement which is extremely interesting. First, because we have something like 195 countries on board, so almost everybody. Because we have commitments, national, voluntary, limited, but still commitments which we can check, monitor, control, and encourage. Whereas before we had a Kyoto Protocol, which was only for industrialized countries, covering something like 20%, I think, of total greenhouse gas emissions. Now we have around 95, 98% of total greenhouse gas emissions. On board, we are traveling together. We have somewhat abandoned the idea of a differentiated responsibility. Yes, responsibility are different from a very industrialized country and developing poor countries, but we are all on the same vessel, as some philosopher told us. We are on the same vessel flying through the universe, and we must find common solutions. So to have an agreement has been something extremely important. We continue to work. I cannot imagine where we would be now without a failure like in Copenhagen 2009, with a lot of efforts. This was a COP21, Conference of the Parties of the Agreement on Climate Change, the 21st. Without an agreement, we would be really in a very bad situation. Now we have a plan, we can work together and go ahead. We must recognize a very important role to the French presidency. Many people were skeptical for the French approach. At the end, it was successful. The French chose not to try to make a compromise, watering down positions, but to try to take on board the more specific requests from the different groups. So developing countries were asking for help, and we have an agreement on the $100 million for financing climate change impact. We have problems in defining what is help, what is not. OECD has done a fantastic exercise, and it has calculated that we would be already at $67 billion versus 100 we need. India has done an alternative study. They have calculated $2 billion. You can imagine there are some differences in methodologies of approach. What do you calculate? Public, private? Do you put in only capital? Do you put interest? How do you put together all these figures? How do you put inside NGOs cooperation? How do you put in the enterprises, compensation measures, and so on? But we are talking of the same thing, and we are trying to find technical, methodological, scientifically based solutions together. We have on board the European Union request of having serious monitoring, serious measurement of what each country is doing. Many developing countries didn't like to be controlled. Many industrialized, so-called advanced countries don't like to be controlled. United States of America, to mention one, but even among European countries. We now have mechanisms for which every country has an accountability report to make every year. Every 2 years. We have a general check altogether, like the Olympics, I think it's every 4 or 5 years. We had the needs of the SIDS, state islands, developing states, le piccole isole del Pacifico, dei Caraibi, piccole isole Stato, who are being submerged, who are the first at risk. And they were asking not for the 2 degrees objective, but they're asking for the 1.5. It has come back into the agreement. There is a tendency, there is an attention to that, which is extremely important. USA didn't want something that they can call an obligation at home. So this agreement is legally binding, but at the same time, it's not a legal instrument. So I may ask to our friend from the legal background to explain us how can you be legally binding and not legal. Anyway, each country can interpret it its own way. USA doesn't need to go to the Congress to be approved. So everybody was happy at the end of that. So it is good to have an agreement. And I completely agree with Xavier. It is very disappointing for economists, but it's good for the global community. It's a strong starting point. Then a number of things arrived in Paris, which are of economic nature that we tend to like. There were two calls from economists. One call organized around Departimento and Nobel Prize Tirol, calling for a global carbon price. I signed it because it was talking about carbon pricing. You signed it too, Xavier. It was talking about carbon pricing and carbon markets. I'm a little bit skeptical about the word carbon price. Maybe, Xavier, on this we can interchange. I don't know a word price of anything. When we talk about the oil word price, it is a price at the margin, on a very small quantity on the daily market. Is it really a good world price? If we take the typical international market, which is aviation, very open, very competitive, can we say that we have a global price for aviation transport? The prices vary extremely in very different ways, very different methodologies and applications, as we know. But it's important to think about carbon pricing, about the carbon market, so the call of the economists is extremely useful. There was a second call of economists around Jean-Charles Lourcade, another French economist, and Bert Metz, asking for innovative finance for climate change. This is another important contribution, I think, to the debate. We had a number of initiatives from governments and enterprises. Enterprises waking up were probably the most important news in Paris. We have the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, served by the World Bank, asking for a carbon price in form of taxation, of tariffs, of markets. We have a fossil fuel subsidies reform. Reform, you can read it, removal, abolition, elimination of fossil fuel subsidies of countries based on G20 agreements, based on countries which are not in G20 but are very active, like Norway and Switzerland, asking for the removal, progressive but certain, of fossil fuels, which are making a lot of damage. We have the G7 carbon markets platform, which has started to work. We will co-chair it with Germany next year. Next year we will have the presidency of the G7 as Italy, and we are proposing to have a G7 environment like this year the Japanese are proposing it, and I'm leaving to Japan for the G7 environment tomorrow. Then, there are a lot of things to say on this topic. Xavier mentioned and touched very briefly on a lot of them, because there's a lot of interesting work to be done at thesis level, at research level, at just a study for an exam level. I am very happy that we have this kind of contribution from economists, policy-oriented. I'm an economist lost in the jungle of the Ministry of Environment. I felt very lonely until a few months ago. We now have this small team of young economists who have joined me at the Ministry of Environment. It's una prima, a first time ever, I would say, in Italian public civil service. We hope it will continue. We hope to have people maybe coming from this room one day to join us. We need strong scientific analysis. So the work that Xavier and other economists which have been doing in the International Panel on Climate Change on the economic chapter is absolutely key. You've been working, I suppose, with Edenhofer, with Carlo Carraro, and many others, Thomas Turner, and many others. It's extremely important that economics is inside this stream of research and contribute to the policy making at national and global level. So thank you very much. I have sometimes the impression that the profession is wasting some time calling for a function, a beta coefficient. We need, obviously, models, macroeconomic and macroeconometrics, but we need to put it at the service of policy making if we want to be useful in some way. Very shortly, a number of elements. We have the question of distributional issues, which is extremely important. Climate change policies can be distributionally positive if you well design them. OECD, UNEP have given us a number of formula through which we can compensate possible, not compulsory, effects on negative effects on distributional aspects. We have a number of countries which are devoting a part of their GDP to fossil fuel subsidies, which is absolutely amazing. I'm thinking to Morocco, Iran, to Malaysia, Indonesia, India, Mexico. They're giving a lot of money based on social issues. They say, oh, we are poor, we have a share of population extremely poor, let's help them, which is absolutely legitimate, and we can obviously share it. But should we help the poor to give them the sensation that energy, that fuels are cheap because they get subsidies on cheap fuel, on cheap energy? Is this the way to show solidarity? There are other ways to show solidarity more directly. Give them the money, let them choose how they want to spend the money, but show the real price. This is something which was coming out, I think, very strongly from Javier's intervention. Let's give the right price, right as much as possible, so that people, consumers, and investors can choose what to invest, what to consume. The question of externalities was raised. Externalities is an extremely important principle. Sometimes it's very difficult to calculate them. So maybe we must try first to calculate externalities, but then we must use the price as a signal. We have a problem of result. So if a carbon tax doesn't work, we can raise it. If a carbon price doesn't work, we can raise it. And the concern about the European ETS giving a very low price is extremely interesting to think about, because we have a number of analysts, of experts who say, well, the price is low because the market is working so well. There has been an economic crisis, less pressure, and so on. We go down to an average of 7 euros per ton of equivalent carbon. It's a fantastic indicator of performance. Apparently, we have to abate emissions by 80, 90, 95% by 2050. This is not efficient. This is not sufficient. The ETS has been, or an extraordinary instrument, but they are the children of compromises among the 28 European Union countries. So we had to agree a number of things and to abandon basic principles like the polluter pays principle or using auctioning. The oldest may remember the auctions of Bank of Italy for the treasury bills and bonds. This is the more simple and effective economic instrument to distribute a limited number of emissions titles that we can distribute around. It's a fantastic instrument, but it's a very difficult instrument because to build a market where it doesn't exist, it's a big challenge. I think our best economists will tell us that in good conditions, ETS, a market, or a carbon tax or equivalent. So it's a question of policy to find what is the best instrument. You may remember why ETS was adopted at European Union level, and it is related to the unanimity rule that Xavier reminded us. In the European Union context, you must have unanimity on fiscal measures. So every time there is a proposal on taxation, you have the British raising the finger. Do we have British friends around the room today? And they say, no, no, this is national policy. We don't want to agree on national policy on taxation and fiscality because this is against our sovereignty. So you cannot move forward. Now you have a second finger raising. It's Poland hiding behind the UK, and we cannot advance. So one of the colleagues of the European Commission had been for studies in the United States. He discovered the markets built for a number of emissions in a number of single states. And he saw that it worked. He imported the idea, it was developed, and we now have an ETS for carbon gases, for greenhouse gas emissions. But this is just a question of politics and good instruments that you can adopt at a certain stage. We have a number of things on which we can work in the policy arena and in the research arena, and we need it. Related to these matters of prices is the exemption from any kind of taxes of aviation fuels and international shipping fuels. I mean, we are paying a lot of taxes on our cars, on transport. We are not paying any taxes on fuels for aviation. Obviously, we like to travel cheap. We like the low-cost companies. But this is a terrible distortion of the market. And if we are able to increase a number of carbon taxations, if you're able to remove a number of fossil fuel subsidies, we are in conditions, for example, to abate income taxes, or company taxes, or taxes on savings, what we call a green tax reform or ecological tax reform, as you prefer. So a tax is not liked, as Xavier said, but it's a very effective instrument, and we can compensate the increase in a tax with other measures. For example, we are using a number of incentives and subsidies for a number of policies. Xavier gave a short description on a number of them. In the Italian policy, this is very traditional. Increasing incentives to renewables, increasing incentives for building efficiency, energy efficiency and restructuring, and so on. We are always very good at spending money. Center-right like center-left. We have some problems in coming back. My idea, and on this I would ask a specific question to Xavier, is if it could not be a good policy option to raise carbon taxes and at the same time getting rid of most of the subsidies. Because subsidies to renewables and to energy efficiency, as it was shown in the presentation, have been extremely effective in raising the share of renewables and improving energy efficiency, but they're very costly. And in Italy, for example, we are a major example in that, we have had some inefficiency in spending money. And with the public debt that we have accumulated, probably we're not in conditions to do that. So an alternative policy could be, this is my sensation, to increase carbon taxes very significantly and to get rid of all subsidies, making harm to the environment, environmentally harmful subsidies, but even subsidies direct to renewables, because the relative prices would remain the same at a different level, and the price signal would be extremely strong. Finally, can I say a word of the role of greening finance, which is increasing? We will try to put it at the center of the G7 activities next year. There's a lot of good work at OECD, at UNEP, in the G20, saying we must green finance. Finance for climate, because we have to raise a certain number of money for helping developing states, but also greening the financial systems. We have launched, with the Ministry of Environment and UNEP, a national dialogue on sustainable finance. We have called banks, insurances, institutional investors to try to see how we can green capital markets, green bonds, and so on. This is an interesting area of work. A last mention is for the policies that we are adopting at the national level. You're probably following the national debate. We are trying to prepare a new strategy for sustainable development, incorporating the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We are setting up a Committee on Natural Capital on the model of a British Natural Capital Committee. The British one is more scientific, with 7 scientist economists. The Italian one will be with ministers and the governor of Bank of Italy, Istat, Enea, ISPRA, and so on. We want to institutionalize the concept of natural capital. We are working on the inventory of environmentally harmful subsidies and environmentally friendly subsidies. This is one of our concerns, and this will be a way to compensate the attempt of green fiscal reform, which has been wasted in the previous mandate. I tried to say too many things probably, but you have a couple of questions for you. Thank you.
Okay, Aldo, thanks a lot for the comments. There are a few things reflecting on your questions that I forgot in mentioning. First, an anecdote. The picture of Canada, which you remember the place, the ghost city. This is the center of the oil sand industry. So it's a kind of funny, which the center of the oil sand industry in Canada, which led Canada outside the Kyoto Protocol, is now, that way. A few things on distribution and subsidies. We are doing some work for Mexico, and what you say is completely right. I mean, it's absurd. I mean, the Mexicans were spending a lot of money in subsidizing gasoline basically, because they don't have diesel in their cars, and this was not only not redistributive, but it was really regressive, because the people who were benefiting from this subsidy were mainly people with higher level of income. So that's a key issue. On the IPCC, yeah, I was with all these people. I was in the chapter on national and subnational policies. So basically, this is the chapter of Thomas Sterner, and what we found is that during these years there has been an increase in
in the number of policies, some of them working well, some others working not that well, but I think that the profession went behind the PCC. I should say, when you saw the especially the American professors who were around, the big people were there. Charlie Colston, Stavins, Hahnemann, all these people were there. I mean, not really senior people were in the panel. So I think that's a good signal of the profession as well, because it's a very tiring process. Because we have to travel a lot, and also it's a fully voluntary process, and you know that in these days where everything is publication, etc., this is a big opportunity cost for academic. I agree a lot on your thoughts on aviation and maritime fuels. These are really polluting sectors, out of control, because they are not only untaxed. The regulations they face are ridiculous. The other day I was watching a TV program here in Italy on Monday on the maritime sector and how polluting they are, and they because they use the worst fuel available with a lot of so sometimes I mean they really cause great damage, and the same with aviation. And it seems that aviation is not working the agreement, right? I mean, the last news from New York are that they are not able to agree. So at the end, that's also another signal of our incapacity, right? As a EU, how we had to retreat from the international aviation.
Or the good capacity of aviation companies to find a way to not take commitments and to avoid carbon pricing.
Yeah, that's true. But the case is that we had to go back, and at the moment I don't know what will happen. It seems that the aviation wants to go into a kind of CDM approach. But many governments are not into this. You know, CDM is this kind of project-based emissions reduction, which means that there is a price, but there is a project where you reduce emissions somewhere else. And I guess that the aviation wants to avoid doing a lot of things themselves, but buying credits to some countries or companies. Another thing I forget before I answer your question on the carbon tax. Sometimes we as economists think of climate policy as something good and it's a bit kind of necessary and externality solving. But every time I see more the other side, which is the destruction of value associated to climate policy. And we have to be aware of that. I mean, there is a lot of destruction of value of Saudi Arabia, of Venezuela, but not only of that, of oil companies in our countries, of Eni, of Repsol, of shareholders having all these things. And this is something we need to take into account, because it's not only the nice view, okay, well, we are going to implement these policies, and there will be a lot of opposition and a lot of value loss, which will affect pension funds, so this is something that perhaps we as economists were not so aware until now. And if we have huge policies, this is going to happen. Regarding carbon taxation, I'm a defender of carbon taxes. I think that if we were able to have a global carbon tax, that would be really the best solution. Even a European carbon tax would be a better solution to what we have, because at the end, all this debate on, okay, the price level would disappear. I doubt, though, that we would be able to keep carbon taxes at a moderate, not high, moderate level during the crisis. After what I saw in the European Parliament, I'm sure that there could be massive exemptions and a lot of lobbying on that. But still, I think it's more powerful and simpler instrument, and I would like to see it, everywhere if possible, in Europe if possible. I know it's very difficult. Spain was one of the countries also which was raising the hand in the 1990s to oppose for the carbon tax, which explains also what I told you about the gasoline tax in Spain. I mean, I don't understand it, but it's a strange case study. I think the problems with carbon taxation, apart from this institutional problem we may have in Europe or in other countries, are two. First, the distributional issue. I think that we can compensate. Yeah, you are right. But people are really afraid of this. I mean, I think people, when I talk to colleagues, to family, to friends outside the profession, I talk, okay, we have to implement carbon tax. It's like, I mean, this is going to raise the electricity price, the gasoline price, and this is going to harm the poor people. That's the first reaction people have. And I guess that this is the case here in this country and in most countries, right? So this is a big, not only how to solve it, but how to sell it issue. And I couldn't say that with all this I said, I think that other policy instruments are necessary, apart from carbon taxes, for climate policies. Some economists think, okay, like the ones on the, okay, this is a carbon market, and if the price is one, because it's a market and the price. You have these people also in the carbon tax arena, which is who say, okay, carbon tax is enough. If we have a carbon tax with a proper level, it solves everything. I doubt it. Not only for the distributional problems and the public issues related to high prices in carbon, but also because there are other market failures in renewables, in low carbon technologies, in energy efficiency that we need to handle. Therefore, I would say that yes, for a carbon tax, preferably a carbon tax to market. That's my view, Xavier's view. A high carbon tax to foster change in behavior and also new technologies, but let's not be like fundamentalists in this, right? Because otherwise we would end up without anything probably.
Thank you.
This is careful. This is dangerous. Eh? We want to.
But it was a sustainable path, sustainable work. Thank you very much, Aldo, for your thoughtful comments, and Xavier for your immediate response. I would like to ask to collect a few questions and comments from the floor. Nicola.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the presentation. Yeah. I'm Nicola Dimitri. I'm a member of the faculty here at the Department of Economics and Statistics. First of all, I would like to thank you for the very interesting presentation. I'm not in and I have a curiosity to ask to Professor Labandeira, after having seen your the slides you actually presented. Let me say preliminarily that I'm not in the environmental economics myself, so I may be asking trivial questions, so please forgive for that. By looking at the graphs that you actually showed, we saw that the emission of CO2 was actually decreasing in Europe, not very much. But at the same time, we saw these prices for emission tradings, if I understood correctly, going down quite a bit. And that was actually caught my interest, because I'm just wondering what could be the reason for that. We saw a decrease which was much more acute in the prices than in the reductions. Because if the prices go down, there could be a number of reasons. One of the reasons could be that firms actually replaced old machinery with new machinery which are pollution-free or whatever, and so they don't need pollution permits, and so demand is low and prices go down, etc. But another possibility, and that's where my not being an environmental economist comes about, is the following. How strict is the monitoring of the quantity of pollution that states produce, and how is the monitoring activity reliable? In other words, if I am a firm and if I know that controls would not be so strict, etc., I'm not demanding permission trades just because I know that I can get by with it. And so pollution remains relatively high and prices go down because lack of demand is due to the fact that I don't really need it, not because I replace machinery, but because monitoring is not as strict. But that's just one possibility. I was just wondering what was your view about this discrepancy in the reduction of emissions and reduction of prices.
Okay, good question. I couldn't explain a lot of the things that I was talking about, and we have some empirical evidence on why prices behave that way. And I would say that we don't have a lot of evidence because, as I told you before, data is still limited, not many people are working in this particular area, etc. But it seems that there is a consensus that most of the effect on prices were due to the crisis.
Should we see also the emissions?
And the emissions also reduced with the crisis, so at the end you have during the crisis a reduction of emissions which are due to less demand of industrial fuels, private fuels, etc. And also, if you have less demand of that at the end in the market, if you have a fixed supply to comply with the cap, of course, price go down. So I would say that this is the main reason. Other issues may be the renewable effect, for instance. So if you have a strong renewable policy, then you may substitute, for instance, in Italy or in Spain, some polluting plants which are emitting CO2 by burning gas or coal, by solar or wind, and that means that the demand for CO2 is reduced, which with a fixed amount of supply creates lower prices and so I would say that that's energy efficiency could be another reason, but probably energy efficiency policies are less important during this period. I would say that the verification and reporting issues in Europe, I mean, this can be an issue for ETS systems or for other type of climate policies. But in Europe, I would say that this is probably quite under control, right? I think it's a procedure which is working. There is a fine if you are caught. You have to have the permits, and you face a fine, and there is I think that there is control. I don't know. Aldo probably knows more because he's in the ministry, so that would be my answer to this.
My feeling is that firms are well estimated because we have a clear definition of technologies and clear consumption of fossil fuels and other sources of greenhouse gases. And when a firm has a better technology, they are immediately ready to report on that and to show that they have less emissions. So it should work more or less. There are other areas where we have problems, and the recent problems with car emissions and controls are a very good proof of it. Opel, Volkswagen, Peugeot and so on, it was demonstrated that there is a problem. At the end of the day, it depends also on the consumer. If we have a very aggressive driving approach, we consume much more than if we have an eco-driving, as it is called.
Thank you. My name is Massimiliano Montini. I am a legal expert and involved in a research center with my friend Simone Borghesi on regulation of sustainability, as many of you know. I have, first of all, a reaction to a legal request of clarification by Aldo Ravazzi. I will shortly answer to that, and then I have a question for Xavier. On the legal reaction, it is unfortunately, I would say, possible in legal terms to have a binding agreement without binding commitments. And this is the case of the Paris Agreement. In technical terms, it is a binding agreement. But in practice, it doesn't have binding commitment because this was the precondition put by the United States, because the United States needed, for constitutional reasons, to have an agreement which does not add any further binding obligation on the United States that is not already included in previous agreements to which they are party. So in fact, they only have binding commitments which are more or less already in the Framework Convention to which they are a member, and all the rest must be voluntary. And this was the only condition they put not to pass the agreement before of the Congress, as you know. So unfortunately, I guess that there was no other solution for the other countries, because otherwise the United States would be against the agreement and you would have no agreement. So this is, in fact, there is a simple explanation in legal terms, although it might be difficult to understand that in maybe logical terms, I would say. But this is the explanation. And I hope this is it's clear, although it's strange. My own question. Let's say I would like to make a remark, and the question starting from something that Alessandro Vercelli said at the beginning, which relates to the fact that we are dealing with climate change and policy option, but we also should consider that we are, let's say, dealing with a big problem with our economic model. And this is what Sandro said at the beginning, which I think it should be part of the picture. Obviously, in the last years, I've been working a lot with environmental economists, and I'm always exposed to this, let's say, relationship between the legal dimension and the economic dimension. And obviously, for me, I feel a bit, let's say, in a strange position to criticize the environmental economics approach. But I think that when you look now at climate change, if we keep on dealing with climate change only as a perfect externality, and we want to solve climate change only in market failure terms, this will not lead to a satisfactory solution if we want to reach the 2050 goals that the European Union has put, or we want to reach the 2 degrees level that the science is telling to us. So I think we should put that into the broader questioning of the economic model we have, which is not only the problem of where Europe is going, it's the problem where developing countries are going. With this economic model, we will not reach what science is telling us. So I think we should have the courage to have, let's say, policy options, which not only may be justifiable in market terms, sometimes there should be choices that we make. And I think the European Union maybe had much more courage in the past than it has now to propose policy options which might be revolutionary or not fully justified in purely economic terms. So I think this is maybe should be part of the game, how we take the courage to have policy options which are not only, let's say, justifiable in economic terms. And I would like to know what you think about that.
Well, difficult question, right? I don't know, I think we can think of different models, right, of other organizations of society. I'm not an expert on that. I cannot give advice on that. I don't have marvelous ideas. I wish I would. For me, with the system we have now, and that's why I try to work with, I think that we can do a lot of things. That we can try to solve many of these problems, and perhaps it's never going to be first best, or it's never going to be possible to solve the externality, but we can progress towards something better. It is possible that we need more revolutionary approaches, but rather in policy terms. I would say that in organizational terms, perhaps, of society, rather than, because in policy terms, what can you have, like bans? You can, okay, you ban this, you introduce compulsory approaches. That may look good, because you say, okay, I ban this type of technologies, or I ban this type of, but then at the end we have the issue of costs. At the end, what's going to happen? Because of my education, because of my capacities, I operate in this different setting. But I'm open to, I'm willing to know about system changes. Unfortunately, I'm not able to give an answer to that. And regarding what's binding at an international level, coming back to Kyoto and Canada, I mean, that was a binding legal, but everybody left, and without costs, and without, so at the end, what's binding, what's not binding, I think it's more like a philosophical issue. From a practical point of view, at international level, there are a few things binding, right? That's my impression.
If you forgive me for a change of hat, I have a question that is strictly related to the last one. It's a general question, but it's related to specific things you said, both of you, before. I think that in the 80s and still in the 90s, there was a great hope that by adopting market-based instruments instead of adopting the command and control instruments, the efficiency of environmental policy would have increased, someone said, of an order of magnitude. So there was a great hope in this direction. I think that if we try to make an assessment after a few decades, this hope was greatly exaggerated. This belief in the efficiency of market instruments proved to be a delusion, and perhaps may have motivated a weakening of direct regulation by law. A possible answer that, if I understood well, was implicit in something that Xavier said, is that it's a process of learning by doing. We have to learn how to use these instruments better and better. But in my opinion, this process of learning by doing is too slow. The urgency of the problem requires that we should perhaps come back, or at least integrate with more energy this sort of instruments. So I'm not against this sort of instrument, but we should integrate them more with what was called, I don't like the name, command and control, that is legal direct regulation. This is my impression. If we want to avoid more than 2 degrees, you showed that impressive graph at the beginning. So I have this impression. I would like to know what both of you, because think on this issue.
Okay. When you see the Pope's encyclica on climate change, there is a paragraph which says that markets for pollution are a disgrace because it's a speculation and it doesn't solve the problem. I think that's not with respect to the Pope, and I like the rest of the encyclica quite a lot, but that part particularly, because of course I work in this area, I found it a bit strange. Because I think that the problem is not with the instrument, it's how the instrument is applied. I mean, you can have a good instrument, but badly applied. You can have a UTS, which is with a lot of flaws and with a lot of problems, and then, of course, it won't work. I agree with you that the expectations of market-based instruments were very high in the late 80s and early 90s. And they haven't materialized. But I don't think because they haven't worked, but rather because they haven't been implemented. I mean, what do we have? We have a few taxes around the world, and actually the ones which were implemented worked, which is usually the case. And when you see the cars here, outside here, and you see the American cars, what's the difference between that? Because of the prices.
They are intrinsically difficult to implement. It's easier to vote in Parliament for issue. Even that is not easy, but maybe easier.
I don't know, but at the same time, we know because that's basic for us. No? It's not. We know that the costs of command and control are higher. And I think we need to keep saying that, I mean, I don't bother a lot if for reducing the pollution in a river we use a strict ban. It's going to be more expensive than, I don't know, a charge or a tax. Fine. Well, if that's easier, the extra cost will be, but here we are talking about billions. I mean, we are talking about huge amounts for the society. And really, this can make the difference of having an effective climate policy or non-effective climate policy. Because the ban-based climate policy may be so expensive that at the end you need to have bans which are really unambitious. So I would say we need to look for an institutional setting, and you are right, which is important as we saw in the EU, and also we need to look for a way of selling this to people. I think it's important so that the other day, talking about experiments, there was a professor from America who was talking about aversion to carbon taxes with experimental economics. And basically, I told him, look, we did a survey in Spain, like 6 years ago, and on climate policies in general, and specifically we also asked about taxes. And people were really reluctant towards carbon taxes as such. So you tell them, we are going to put a carbon tax. No. I mean, responsibles are, the government is responsible for this, they should solve the problem, the firms are responsible for this, they should. And also, the second part was, okay, but the carbon tax, the money is going to the government. The carbon tax may be used by electricity companies to raise the rates even more than they should and get more money. Poor people may be affected. These are the issues. So at the end, when we presented a different package, which was, okay, carbon tax, but at the end, the money goes to renewables. At the end, the government will control rates of electricity to avoid windfall profits. Then people accept it. So I think it's not only a question of the instrument, it's like the packaging, the way you present, and that may be useful for policymakers, because you know that you may have a problem to pass a carbon tax, but not a package based on a carbon tax. That could be a way, I don't know.
I would add, I think, two elements of reflection. The first is that my feeling is that for environmental policies, the tradition was to use command and control instruments. So we tried to introduce economic instruments because the theory of economics was suggesting they were more efficient. Obviously, not all the time and not everywhere. And we have to adopt probably mixes of that. But the first dynamics, which is dangerous, is that when we enlarge from the small number of economists who study environment and including climate to the larger community of economists, we have problems of communication there, which are extremely important. So we may make the best analysis and research if we keep it for our Italian association or European association of environmental or ecological economists. We have then problems in communicating outside. The second is that the question of communication comes back also on how you present things. When you make a survey, if you say, do you want a carbon tax? No, thank you, as you say, Alessandro. If you say, we need to raise a new tax, do you prefer a carbon tax or an income tax or a tax on fat or whatever? The answer is already different. Probably if we announce that we are abating radically the income tax, this might be heard with some interest, and they will ask, how do you do it? Well, we introduce a little carbon tax, and this is a different way of announcing things. And then the question is of the effectiveness of instruments. We have an incredible number of instruments which have been adopted across countries, but they are not effective. They are not having an impact. If you go in the OECD database on environmental taxation and instruments for environmental policy, you find a lot of ideas. But if you put a 0.01% of things, it doesn't work. Look to the carbon pricing. On the ETS, the price in the last years is 7. In the Italian attempt in '99 of a carbon tax, we were introducing progressively something between 0 and 30. Then we had to cancel it because of inflation fears. The French recent is between 30 and 50, and the Swedish are already at 130, 150, so it's feasible. And the British, who do not want to take common action, but they do very good independent autonomous action, they have a carbon tax and a carbon ceiling and roof on things, which works on all sectors, not only on ETS sectors, but also on non-ETS. That's very interesting. So it was overestimated, but in a very small groups of experts, not in the analysis of a large community.
My name is Simone Bastianoni, and I teach environmental chemistry, so please forgive me if I say some very bad things in economic terms. I hope you will excuse me. Obviously, coming from my roots, I'm skeptical about more market-oriented policies, and especially in this sense, I'm afraid about timing. In the sense that, I mean, we might end up being very late in what we should do because we have waited for the market to adjust, and this can be not really early enough for us to stay well in our planet. This is my first comment. I would like your reaction. And a second question instead for both is about the consumer responsibility approach. Simone and I have published a couple of papers about it with Massimiliano. We are talking about this approach quite a bit. And we really think it would be much more effective also in communicating a carbon tax based on consumer responsibility, because the competitiveness of local firms could be not put in danger. On the contrary, it could gain in competitiveness because we have a lower carbon intensity with respect to China or places from where we import. So is this issue of carbon responsibility from the consumer side on the table of the debate, of the real debate, or we are talking and working on something that will never happen because there are reasons for which it's not going to work ever.
Let me say one sentence and then you close because it's your conference. We have a problem in convincing people and be based on cultural and social behavior. I think we can touch maybe 5, 10, 20, 30% of consumers and convince them. But we have to bring the left, what is left, the 70 or 90%. It's like the idea of best practices from enterprises. We need best practices. They show the way. They are innovative. They can be replicated and so on. But we must find ways for replicating this and bring with us all the economy. That's, I think, is our big challenge. We cannot rely on personal conviction or best practices.
In the seats we have to convince anyone, for example, that the carbon of some sort has to be why not jump the bridge immediately and go towards the consumer responsibility approach instead of much more effective in reducing carbon emissions.
Well, a couple of comments on your questions. I agree with you on the timing. I think we don't have time. I think I was clear on that, and we need to act quickly. And the tools we have are bad. Starting for the Paris Agreement, which is the cornerstone of everything, because it needs probably we would need a different approach, macro approach. But I want to stress that market-based instruments are a mean. I mean, they are not. If I gave the impression that I came here to like a catechism of economists, and market-based instruments should be no. I mean, they are a means to achieve a reduction of emissions, right? And what we say is it's a good means from an economic point of view, because if we had to spend 1 billion in reducing whatever tons of emissions, we know that this will be done with market-based instruments at 1 billion and perhaps with command and control at 1.2 billion. It is possible to do it the other way, but it will be more expensive, and we have a lot of money which we can use in schools or in education or in health or whatever. I think that's important, right? So I could say that, and the lesson we have from Europe is that, well, I mean, our targets are more or less, compared to the rest of the world, the indicators are progressing more or less well. Of course, perhaps not enough, but of what people expect of us or what our role in the world should be. And part of this is due to these market-based instruments, part of it is due to other policy instruments, part of it is due to non-policy, like the economic crisis. But I would say, let's not think on the carbon tax as the mission of economists to put the carbon. No, I mean, the carbon tax is a means to solve the problem with other instruments. And we think it's the best mean. But second, consumer responsibility. I'm not an expert on this, but I always tell people that this is not an issue of governments. It's not an issue of firms only. Of course, they should be into this, but people can do a lot of things. And not only voting politicians, not only choosing what products they use, not only changing their habits. I mean, they have a lot of things to do, actually, most things to do. People don't like to listen to this because they prefer to think of this as a kind of too conspiracy by the firms, the governments, and the oil companies. At the end, of course, I mean, we can do a lot, and consumer responsibility can play a role. And I would say that it can play a role two ways. One, with information, but you target what Aldo was saying, a group of people only. I may buy organic food, or I may buy an electric car because I have a certain ideology, a certain way of seeing the world, or what. But many other people don't. And for these people, incentives work. It's sad, but it is like that. And incentives work. And the car you have in America for the same person, you would have in Italy, they would have a different car with the same, because of the incentives of prices of gasoline, etc. Right? So I would say that we can use this information also as a basis for pricing. For instance, we can have a carbon footprint of products, and we can use that to approach, the proper price. And that way, the product from the Siena area will be cheaper than the product from, I don't know, Switzerland. And in a way, that's not responsibility in terms of, ideological responsibility, but, this guy goes to the supermarket, sees this, and takes the cheaper one, which is the best.
Started 2 hours and a half ago, so I would like to thank again our speakers, not only for their lucidity but also for their passions.